Well, it is past time for us to begin this evening. We turned the lights off to make sure that, could have a dramatic entrance there. We started like Chicago Bulls used to do and have the spotlights going around and I could run in, but at 48, my running days are done, I think. So we're glad you're here. Those of you that are tuned in with us, we're glad you're here. And those of you that are here, especially gathered with us this evening, we're glad that you're here. If you haven't gotten one of the introductory material books or the little John Gospels that we've given out so that you can take notes and whatnot in, there's some more of those back in the back, and you can avail yourself to those. But we do want you to take notes and write down some of the things we're talking about. Turn that into a study guide that you can have for your own convenience, and we'll talk a little bit as we get into John chapter 1 again in just a moment. But just by way of reminder, of course, I told you that this was the way it would be at the first of every class. John tells us in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, why that he wrote this book. Why did he write this book? Many other signs truly to Jesus were not written in this book, but these are written, why? So that you might believe, and believing you might have life. You might believe that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah or the Anointed One, and through that belief in Him, you could have everlasting life. And we talked about last week how that signs in the Gospel of John in particular aren't always miracles. They are something that happens, something that Jesus does that has a deeper spiritual meaning. And we talked about that quite a bit last week, and we're going to see that even as we move forward in the Gospel of John. But we talked about last week in particular the idea that Jesus is God. That's what he focused on in the first five verses rather. And then he takes a little interlude here, and he introduces a character that we're going to talk about quite a bit this evening, and that is John, is all he calls him. You notice in the Gospel of John, John does not mention himself. We've talked about that. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the one he loved, or the one that leaned on his breast at the table, or something of that nature. So he doesn't have to distinguish John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, as he's usually called in the other Gospels. He doesn't have to distinguish him. He just calls him John. And he says these three times. Notice here in verse 7, he came as a witness to bear witness, to bear witness. And this idea of being a witness or bearing witness or testimony it's a key word in the Gospel of John, and it's the same word that testimony or bear witness or a witness comes from, but it's throughout this Gospel. He's trying to build a case for Jesus so that you can believe that Jesus is the Anointed One, the Messiah or the Christ, and that belief will allow you to have life. And then he spends some time talking about the light. He did that in verses 4 and 5. He reminds us John is not the light, but the true light. He gets back to talking about in verse 9. He's coming into the world. He already told us he was the creator of the world. He created the world. He came into the world, and the world didn't receive him, didn't know him. But we talked about at the very end of class last week, we really spent several minutes on verses 12 and 13. And I told you this is a really key couple of verses for this passage, but it's really a good couple of verses for us to remember when we're trying to get people to follow Jesus, and for us to remember as we follow Jesus, and certainly for us to remember as we continue studying through the Gospel of John. Verse 12, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name. So you remember we talked about last week that the people that believed in Jesus are the same people as the ones who received Jesus. He gave the right to become children of God who were born. So the ones who received Jesus were who? They were the ones who believed in Jesus, and they were the ones who were born again. Who were the ones who were born again? They were the ones who received Jesus, and they were the ones who believed in Jesus. Who were the ones that believed in Jesus? They were the ones who received Jesus and were born again. It's the same group of people that he's talking about, but he uses these three ways to describe him. And it's the same three actions. They're described differently, but it's the same thing that he's talking about, and he does that throughout the book. And then in verse 14, he says, and we're really starting with verse 15 tonight, talking about John, but we'll include verse 14 to kind of remind us of what's going on. He says, and the Word became flesh. And we mentioned last week that this is the whammy verse. All the time that you're reading through John chapter 1, if you didn't know anything else about what was going on, the Word was God. Okay, I get that. He's the Creator. He's the one that was in the beginning. He's always been. He's the light of the world. He brings life. That's God. And then he says, oh, by the way, the Word became flesh. Do what? How does God put on flesh? And why would he put on flesh? And this is a shocking verse if you can put yourself in first century mind as someone who is not a follower of Jesus to read this. But yet, in 1 John chapter 1, he's going to talk about John Will, how that we saw him and we held him, and with our senses we realize he's a real physical guy. He became a human. And he dwelt among us. And we mentioned last week that it's literally tabernacle. It's a tent. And I don't remember if I had time to tell you or not, but we used to, when I was growing up, Mama and Papa camped all the time. They especially liked to go to Natchez Trace. And me and my brother and my cousin, every time they would take us, we would go with them. And we loved camping, in part because, Mama and Papa let you do more than Mom and Daddy does, and we'd ride our bicycles all over that campground. I got hung on my cord there. We'd ride our bicycles all over that campground, and we'd play baseball down at the baseball field. And the food, Mama's cooking and Papa's cooking. Of course, there was always about 2 quarts of vegetable oil, I think, on everything that we fried, And he had this, you remember the old glass bottle Coke machines that had a lid and you had to run it through the little thing. He had one of those, and he'd taken the guts out of and reworked it and used it as the camping refrigerator for their pop-up camper. And Papa, I don't know if he did it accidentally or on purpose, but it kept everything probably about 10 degrees colder than what it was supposed to. So Mama's sweet tea had these slivers of ice in it, and the milk had these slivers of ice in it. It was wonderful, Going camping with Mama and Papa was about as close to heaven this side of it as you could have. But I don't remember one time at the end of the week or 2 weeks or however long we went with us saying, we'd really like to sleep here in a sleeping bag on the ground in a tent for a little while longer. Because Natchez Trace was wonderful, but it wasn't home. And we were ready to go home, see. It's a temporary thing. And that's what Jesus did here. He tabernacled among us. He dwelt in a tent among us. Sometimes we have a hard time following Jesus because Jesus knew when he came to this earth, it was to do the Father's will, and he was going to tabernacle or tent here for a little while and then go home. And we've fallen in love with the campground. And we want to stay sleeping in a tent rather than go home. So he dwelt among us, and we've seen his glory. And this is a key word in the book of John. I know we talked about last week a little bit how this reminds us of Exodus 33 and the glory that God showed Moses on top of Mount Sinai. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. And some of your translations may say only begotten, and we'll deal with that more as we get further into John. Full of grace and truth. Well, you jump down to verse 17 and you notice grace and truth is mentioned there again. That's why Jesus came, was to bring grace and truth. Sunday morning, we're continuing our series on the gospel, and that's what we're going to talk about Sunday, is Jesus coming to the earth. And it fits really well with this John chapter 1 context. I didn't necessarily plan it that way, but sometimes, I don't know if it's the Holy Spirit or what's going on, but things work out better than even I plan it sometimes, but they fit really well together. But he's bringing grace and truth. And then in verse 15, he gets back on John, who he had introduced to us back up in verse 6 and following. But he says, John bore witness about him and cried out, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. All right, you want me to buy that God became flesh? That's a pretty tough sell. John. I don't know. Well, let me call witness number one to the stand. He got a subpoena, and now John's coming to the front of the courtroom, and he's sitting down, and they say, you know, Jesus says, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me? And he says, yes. And John proceeds to talk about what he said. John bore witness about him. And he said, this is who I was talking about when I said that he who comes after me is greater than me. This is who I'm talking about. And the reason why he's greater than me is because he came before me. Now, those of you that are here on Sunday mornings for Bible class, we're studying Luke. We've slept a few times since then, but you remember back in Luke, kind of intertwined with the telling of the birth of Jesus, who else's birth is talked about in Luke? You remember? John the Baptizer, right? Who was born first, John the Baptizer or Jesus? John. Wait a minute. Now the prosecutor's jumping up and saying, objection. He's contradicting himself. Luke said that John was born before Jesus, about 6 months before, if they had natural term limits. And now John says Jesus is greater than me because he was before me. How was he before him if he was? Sounds like some kind of, riddle me this, Batman. This sounds like the riddlers come into the text, doesn't it? How can a man be before a man who was born before the first man? He was from the beginning. The text is telling us. And that's what John is recognizing. And see, John knew Jesus, his cousin, but he didn't always know Jesus was God, that Jesus was the Word, that Jesus was Messiah. Now, later on in the Gospel of John, he's going to talk about how that he was greater than Abraham because he was before Abraham. And they get all in a tizzy and pick up stones ready to do away with him because he was from before the beginning. Because he was the creator. He was not created, he was creator. And so, before I ever was born, before the world was ever created, Jesus was here. He who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. For from his fullness, now this totality of divinity in the spiritual realm, for from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. That's what Jesus came to bring, remember, he's the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Verse 14, Moses, he's going to tell us in the next verse, brought us the law, grace and truth comes to Jesus. How do you explain grace? And we'll sometimes say, well, it's unmerited favor, or it's when you get something you don't deserve, or something like that. But how do you really explain the grace that God gave us? Larry's over there going, I think that's the right answer. You can't. And because we can't, it was so necessary for Jesus to come. Jesus is not only the grace that God offers, he's the explanation of God's grace. He shows us what grace is all about. Grace on top of grace. And then again, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And all the Jews understood how important Moses was because he brought the law, but the law no one had ever kept perfectly. And the only way that it could save is if you kept it perfectly. Now we sometimes will say that in an improper way, I believe. We'll say, well, nobody could keep the old law. Well, that's saying that God gave something that he knew from the beginning was impossible, that was dooming us to begin with. I don't think that it was impossible. It's just that we weren't. There was no fault in the law. The fault was in us. And so there's the law, but the only way the law can save is if you keep it without blemish. And Paul spends a bunch of time in Romans talking about that. But once you've messed up, what do? You need grace, don't you? And you need truth. And that's what Jesus brings. No one's ever seen God. The only God who's at the Father's side, He has made Him known. This only God, one of a kind, unique, is who Jesus is. And then He says He's at the Father's side. Now, when John is writing this, is after Jesus has gone back and ascended to the Father, back after He's been glorified again, exalted again. We'll talk about that Sunday morning in the lesson from Philippians 2. But after He's been exalted and glorified again, that's where He's at now. But He says He has made Him known. If you study Bible study books or something of that nature, you go to a preacher school or something of that nature, you'll hear sometimes people talk about exegesis. And exegesis is two Greek words put together that means to lead and out of. And the idea behind exegesis is that we're not trying to go into the text and prove our point, that we're trying to pull out of the text what the text says, to allow it to explain itself. And that's what he's saying about Jesus. That's literally the Greek word that he used here, is that Jesus explains God. He's made Him known. He's shown us who He is. He's explained the Father. He's explained the Spirit. He's explained God better than we've ever known before. And so Jesus will talk about repeatedly, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And all of the attributes that we talk about Jesus are true of God the Father and God the Spirit because He's God. So, John is bearing witness about this Jesus, and here's what his testimony is. We talked about back up here in verse 15, John bore witness. We talked about back up here in verse 7 that he came to bear witness. So what was the testimony? And you'll notice it's colored in the same color because it's the same Greek word. When he's bearing witness, what was the testimony that he gave? He says, this is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? Now, a couple things I need to point out about this. First of all, when the Jews came to question him, what nationality was John? He was a Jew. What nationality was John the Baptist? He was a Jew. What nationality was Jesus? A Jew. And yet all through the Gospel of John, you're going to see him say repeatedly, the Jews were conspiring too. The Jews were questioning him. The Jews were this and the Jews were that. In the Gospel of John, that's the way that John uses that term, the Jews. Even though Jesus is a Jew, the disciples are Jews, John the Baptist is a Jew, a lot of the followers that are going to come along are going to be Jews. But in John, when he talks about the Jews, almost always, I don't want to say always, I think it's always, but I don't want to say almost always because there may have been a time or two he didn't. But at least almost always, when he's talking about the Jews, he's talking about the Jewish people that were opposed to Jesus, okay? It's a unique way that John uses it. One of the things we have to as I mentioned, you want to read through a book in one sitting and notice words that are repeated, but you also want to know the way that he uses those words, and that's the way that he's using this term of the Jews. So they sent priests and Levites to ask John who he was. But what tribe was John from? He was a Levite. How do we know he was a Levite? His daddy was a Levite. Remember, he was in the temple serving after the order of his tribe whenever he found out you're going to have a baby. And he says, what are you talking about? We're old. And, well, if that's all you're going to say, then you're just going to not let you talk again. Sound like very much the way I would have treated my boys, the way that God treated him. But nonetheless, he's a Levite. So you've got the priests and the Levites. All the priests were Levites, but all the Levites weren't priests. The priests and Levites are coming out to one of their own and saying, who are you? But maybe if we put it in Tennessee language, it would maybe fit the translation of what was really going on. It's not like you meet someone, we were out at the lectureship at Bear Valley, and you'd start talking to somebody and say, now, who are you? That's not, this is like when your mom and daddy would kind of do this number and say, who do you think you are? That's what they're doing with John. Who do you think you are, that you're out here baptizing all of these Jews and Gentiles out here in the wilderness? Who do you think you are, preaching and teaching out here, drawing everybody away, doing the things you're doing, saying the things you're saying? I mean, John's not if you walked up to John, you wouldn't have walked up and say, I bet he's a priest or a Levite. Probably wouldn't have done that. John didn't go into it, but the other gospel writers talk about the way he was dressed and the things that he ate and where he lived. And he was wild and woolly, and didn't fit what they would have thought the priests and Levites loved, wearing their fancy clothes and their priestly garments. They wanted everybody to recognize that's our religious leaders, and they wanted people to give them that authority and give them that respect. And John's he's not falling into any of that. He's out here doing who do you think you are to break away from all our traditions doing the things that you're doing? So he confessed. And the word confess just means to admit something, and did not deny. And literally, these two words are the opposite of each other. Deny is the opposite of confess. Confess is the opposite of deny, but of course he says he did not deny. So what he's saying is he confessed and he did not confess. He's saying it both ways to show that John was eager and willing to talk about what they wanted to talk about. So who are you? Who do you think you are? And he says, well, I'm not the Christ. That's obviously who you're thinking that I am, and how John knew that, we're not told, but I'm not the Christ. Now, that term Christ, we sometimes think of it as that was Jesus' last name, Danny Cash, Johnny Shanklin, Corey Sawyers, Jesus Christ. They had on the mailbox, J. Christ out there, But Christ is a title. It's a word just means anointed. It's the Greek equivalent of the Jewish word Messiah. And it would probably be better if we put "the" in front of it every time. Jesus, the Christ, because it's not his name, it's a title. Being anointed meant that you were a prophet or a priest or a king. And, of course, Jesus is all of those things. He's our great high priest. He's our judge. He's a prophet in that he's speaking for God, and he's the king of all kings. But specifically, that's the idea here, and we'll see that in just a minute. So he says, I'm not the Christ. That's number one of things he confessed and did not deny. I'm not the Christ. And they asked, what then? Are you Elijah? Now, why would they say, are you Elijah? Well, in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, you've got this prophecy of this one like Elijah who's going to come. And the last thing that God has someone write to his people before 400 years of silence, in the very end of that book, and the very end of that last one that he gives them, he says there's going to come one, a prophet like Elijah. Someone like Elijah. In the way that he looks, in the way that he acts, in the way that he preaches. Are you that guy? That was a second prophecy that they thought that was in there. They're separating these things even though they all go together. Are you Elijah? He said, I'm not. Third question, are you the prophet? Now, anytime you see a question like this asked in reference to Jesus, you should go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, when another prophecy was given that there would come one, a prophet like Moses. And looking back, sometimes it's easy for us to say, those silly Jews, how could they not put all that together? Well, hindsight's 20/20, and it's easier when you've had the Holy Spirit and the disciples and the apostles and the prophets go back and explain all of that. But they got in their mind that this was three separate things, that that there was going to be this Messiah, this king that would sit on David's throne. There's going to be an Elijah-like guy that's going to be a preacher that's wild and woolly like Elijah. And then there's going to be this prophet like Moses. Later on, whenever you get to about chapter 6 in John, they're really going to be focused on the are you the prophet like Moses with Jesus, and want to make him king then because of that. And he says, his answer again is no. So again they ask, well then who are you? We need to give an account to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? So this is why I say this is more like our parents kind of putting their hands on the hip saying, who do you think you are? We got to go back and tell them something. Now, who do you think you are to be doing all these things and saying all these things as you're saying? If you're not one of these guys, then what authority do you have that you're doing this? And he said, I am the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness. That one is who? The Word, right? I'm the one crying out in the wilderness. Make straight the pathway of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said in Isaiah 40 and verse 3. They said, we want you to talk about you, John. You're doing all these things. You're preaching all these things. You got all these people that are coming out here, and they're listening to you. They're being baptized by you. They're following you. Tell us who you are. And you know what John's answer is? I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about Jesus. Now, he didn't know it was Jesus at the time, but I want to talk about the Word. I want to talk about the one who sent me. I want to talk about the one that I'm here to make straight the paths for, that I'm preparing the way for. Well, that's a great lesson for us. There's too many preachers that would rather talk about themselves than they would talk about Jesus. That they try to build a name for themselves, and how many gospel meetings I can hold, or how many books I can write, or how much fame and acclaim that I have. Sometimes I get tickled whenever we want to have a gospel meeting or something of that. I don't mean we, this congregation. I just mean in general in the church. And what's some big name brotherhood guy that we can get? And all of the people around us, they don't know one big name brotherhood preacher from another. They just don't. That's not what impresses them. And it shouldn't be what impresses us. We can announce that a congregation's having a gospel meeting at such and such time, at such and such place, and brother so-and-so that I've never heard of is going to be speaking, and But then we find out brother so-and-so is going to, well, I need to go hear brother so-and-so, you know. Sometimes we want that fame and acclaim. Sometimes elders worry more about numbers on the tote board or numbers in the contribution basket. Sometimes members want to think more about, am I everybody's favorite teacher in Sunday school or whatever? John is a great lesson for us in that they said, tell us about you, and he says, I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about Jesus. That ought to be our mission every day of the week. I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about Jesus. Now, what was the song on that Disney cartoon that I don't know, gets stuck in everybody's head, and we don't talk about, what, you know, what is that song? You see, you just did, though. We don't talk about Bruno. No, no, no. And that's all it is. It's kind of like an Imagine Dragons song. They just take the same phrase and repeat it over and over, you know. Sometimes we're that way about Jesus. We don't talk about Jesus. No, no. And that should be everything that we're about. He says, I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said. Now, they have been sent from the Pharisees. These priests and Levites, they said, we've got to go back and give an account to the ones that sent us. Who sent us was the Pharisees, the religious sect that was in charge of the Sanhedrin and was basically the leaders of the people at this point for the most part. And so they asked him, then why are you baptizing? And it wasn't that they weren't familiar with baptism. We've talked about this before, and Danny and Johnny and Ron can verify. I don't know if others of you have been over to Israel, but everywhere you go, there are these baptismal pools everywhere, right? They're just everywhere. They're called mikvahs because mikvah is the Hebrew word. The noun means a baptismal pool. The verb form of mikvah means to immerse. Baptism is a transliteration of the Greek word that means to immerse, to dip, or to plunge. That's what it means. And that, of course, goes alongside with the ways that it's illustrated. You're dead, so we're going to bury you and then bring you to life in Jesus, that type of thing. But they were familiar with it. Even before Jesus and Christianity came on the scene, they would baptize, they would immerse Gentiles as a ceremonial cleaning to show that they were once unclean, but now they're followers of the true one living God. They would, the Jewish people, before they would go all around the Temple Mount, or these mikvahs, these baptismal pools, and they're huge, they're massive, and they've got a big staircase in each of them that you go down one side and you immerse, and then you come back up the other side so that your shoes aren't walking on the side that was unclean that you walked down on. You're walking on the clean side now. They did that all the time. All of the little places that you find where they've dug up little communities or synagogues or whatever, you'll find these mikvahs, and they're all around the Temple Mount and whatnot. They were familiar with baptism. The problem wasn't with the baptism. We don't understand, John, why you're doing it out here. The way you look and the way you act. By the way, that's a great encouragement for us, or it should be, the fact that God will oftentimes use people that don't look the part or sound the part. I don't look like a preacher. I don't have clothes like a preacher. I don't sound like a preacher. And I could say check, check, check on all of those, but He can use and often uses the ones that we would least likely think most of the time. So, why are you baptized? If you're neither the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet, there's all three of those they asked him about. And John answered them, I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know. Well, why don't you know him? Remember back up in verse 10 what it said? Look back up at verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He's right here in your midst. He's standing right here in your presence. And at this point, John doesn't know that it's Jesus, his cousin, but he knows, I've been sent to baptize. I've been sent to make way for the Lord. I've been sent to prepare the path for the Lord. So I know he's here somewhere. I'm not sure who he is. He's going to explain in just a minute how he would know who he is. But he's here somewhere in the midst of us, and you don't even recognize who he is. He says, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie. That's how much more awesome that he is. He's way above us. He's far above us. And that's why I'm serving him. And that's why I'm trying to make the path for him. And he's right here in your midst, and you won't even recognize him. And so a question we ought to ask ourselves is, do we recognize Jesus? Do we recognize the work that he's laid out, the love that he has shown, the grace and mercy that he has, the concern for souls that he has? Sometimes it's easy for us to get caught up in the business of life, the hobbies of life, the busyness of life. Sometimes even in the church, it's easy to get caught up in, and I'm involved in a program, and I'm here when the doors are open on Sunday night and Wednesday night, and I do this, I put money in the plate, and I take the Lord's Supper, but do you really get who Jesus is? We can be immersed every day. And we can put money in the baskets in the back every day. And we can be here every time the doors are open. And we can carry our Bibles back and forth. We can take the Lord's Supper and never use a piano and all of these things. But without Jesus, what is it? It's nothing. And that's the purpose of this gospel. You need to see who Jesus is. You need to follow Jesus, not our 7 elders, good and godly men. They can't save you. Not your preacher. I try to be a good and godly man, but I can't save you. What matters is, are you following Jesus? Are you full of grace and truth? Are you here to show that grace and who the Father is to others? Are you more willing to talk about Him than yourself? That's who He is. And then he ends this little section here in verse 28 by saying, these things took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. Now, this is probably not the Bethany that Lazarus is from, Mary and Martha's from. This is probably the Bethany that's on the east side of the river, just slightly north of the Dead Sea. Nevertheless, I love how that verse, when you first read it, you say, that has nothing to do with anything we just talked about. It also has nothing to do really with anything else we're going to talk about. So why is it in there? I love whenever the Bible just throws in, here's some facts. Remember, we talked about witness and testimony. We talk about how this is kind of set up in a lot of ways like a courtroom scene, you know. Here's where it took place. Here's the fact. Whenever I come home and I ask my boys when they were younger, what are you doing? And you get that kind of bland answer. Well, we were playing. What were you playing with? Well, some stuff. You know, and what you find out is they've gone out to the shed and got some paint rollers and paint, and they're painting, you know, the refrigerator or something. You know, I don't know. They're being very generic because they don't want to tell you the specifics. But over and over again, we keep getting these specifics. These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. So, reader, first century especially, don't believe me? Go over there and look and see what's going on. Go ask some people. There's probably still some people that are living that was there. I was there. And even today, we can go over there to those places and we can see some of these things that for years historians say, well, that's not even real. History doesn't have anything, you know. And then they're digging one day and clunk, what's that? And then they dig up this city of these people that for years historians have said didn't really exist. So he says, come and see. In fact, if you look on down, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it'll be a good way to stop, I guess. If you look down to verse 39, notice that's what he says. He says to them, come and you will see. And then you drop down to verse 46, come and see, Philip tells Nathanael. So are you a skeptic? We're wanting you to believe that Jesus is the Christ because believing in Him is the only way you can have life in His name. But it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay not to buy it hook, line, and sinker the first time we talk about Him. Just keep coming and keep seeing. Keep listening to the testimony. Keep examining the facts. And let's see if by the end of this I can't convince you that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the one you need to serve. All right, so if you'll begin reading for next week in verse 29, then we'll begin next week. Try to get through the rest of the chapter next week, but we'll talk about this idea that he's really going to focus on that goes very well with our reaching out theme of how we can be evangelistic to others. So I hope you'll be here next Wednesday for that. And we appreciate those that have joined us online, and as that y'all are being cut off, we would invite you to come and be with us anytime you can in person. We have a few announcements, though, that we want